which is Deuteronomy chapter 31. So, as I mentioned, I feel like today feels like a particularly opportune moment to spend a few minutes reflecting on the holiday of Sukkot. We find ourselves on this Shabbat morning more than halfway through the holiday. Today is the 5th day of Sukkot. Yet, I find that even that simple numerical fact belies the overlooked status that Sukkot holds for so many of us. After all, how many days does Sukkot even have? Are Shmini Atzeret and Simchas Torah part of Sukkot, or are they something else entirely? I think that we can generally get on board with the idea of sitting in a sukkah or shaking the lulav and etrog together, but many of the finer details of this holiday, much of the meaning that we're supposed to draw out of it, gets lost in the fog of the post-high holidays spiritual hangover. I don't believe it was always so. Sukkot in the biblical text is very distinctively referred to as Zman Simchatenu, the time of our joy. Thinking back to biblical and temple times, Yom Kippur certainly was not the day when everyone showed up. The ritual practice on Yom Kippur was centered on one man, the high priest, going in one room, the Holy of Holies, where no other human being was allowed, ever. Yom Kippur was a somber day in which the high priest, this one man, acted on behalf of all the people. Sukkot, conversely, was the people's holiday. Of all the festivals, Sukkot was said to have attracted the largest number of pilgrims. Sukkot represents a unique moment in the psyche of an agricultural people. They can rest a bit and celebrate at the completion and safe storage of that year's harvest. But they also find themselves immediately looking toward the future as they pray for rain for the next year and remember how tenuous and precious each successive season is, that no source of joy can be taken for granted. This joy and the intensity of their weather-based prayers and offerings are commanded to all the people, men, women, and children, as well as the stranger in their midst and the dispossessed. And if Sukkot back then was more special than we might otherwise give it credit for, Sukkot during the Shemitah year, the sabbatical year, was even more extra special. We read about this just a few weeks ago in Parshat Vayelech, Deuteronomy chapter 31. Granted, at the time I was preparing a sermon about the Shemitah year, but even so, I have not been able to get this passage out of my mind. And I'm reading from Deuteronomy chapter 31, beginning at verse 10. And Moses instructed them, I'm going to start from verse 9. Moses wrote down this teaching and gave it to the priests, sons of Levi, who carried the ark of Adonai's covenant, and to all the elders of Israel. And Moses instructed them as follows. Every 7th year, the year for remission, at the Feast of Booths, when all Israel comes to appear before Adonai your God in the place that God will choose, you shall read this teaching aloud in the presence of all of Israel. Gather the people, men, women, children, and the strangers in your communities, that they may hear and so learn to revere Adonai your God and to observe faithfully every word of this teaching. Their children, too, who have not had the experience, shall hear and learn to revere Adonai your God as long as they live in the land that you are about to cross the Jordan to possess. It's a truly remarkable commandment. It strikes me as so different from Simchas Torah that we'll be celebrating this week and our own kind of never-ending cycle of Torah reading. I think in many ways, we take for granted how accessible the Torah and Torah study has become. The full text is available at our fingertips on demand, in the scrolls behind me, in this book, fully annotated online. And thankfully, at least in the more liberal Jewish world, that privilege of access is egalitarian and expansive. Any adult that wants to engage with the text is hopefully given the opportunity to do so, and we begin teaching our children these all-important values and texts as soon as we can, something going on in the room directly below us at this very moment. I think, however, that it can be really hard to imagine ourselves living in a different world, in the ancient world, a world without books, a world before books, a world where literacy isn't a given, where life is always lived on the edge as you struggle to sustain yourselves, your families, and your communities. A world where gender was even more of a divisive social barrier. This was also a world where you could not necessarily hope to overcome your social status. You carried with you your status as a stranger, a slave, or a servant. This gathering that the text describes every 7 years was called the Chol, which means to assemble. It was the assembly of all the people. Maimonides paints a striking picture of what it may have looked like in the time of the Second Temple. Trumpets are blown throughout all Jerusalem to assemble the people. A high pulpit made of wood is brought and set up in the midst of the court of women. The king goes up and sits on this pulpit so that the people may hear the reading, and all of Israel who went up to observe the feast gather around him. I imagine a crush of people moving forward around that pulpit, hoping to hear these words straight from the king's mouth. All of this forms the core of what is to become the hallmark of our own services and gatherings. The rabbis of the Talmud adapt this public reading to a weekly occurrence, instituting Torah reading not only on Shabbat morning, but also Shabbat afternoon, Monday morning, and Thursday morning, so that we never go more than 3 days without publicly reading the Torah. The text that I read in verse 9, listing the Kohanim, the sons of Levi, and the elders of Israel, forms our own tradition of calling a Kohen and a Levi to the first 2 aliyot of the Torah. 3 days between public readings is obviously a much, much different standard than every 7 years. And imagine how important this public reading was, especially with the emphasis on children and the next generation. That no child should go through more than 7 years of life without being brought to Jerusalem to see and participate in this spectacle, to have it imprinted on their young brains how important these teachings are, and how the teaching and this experience really is aimed squarely at them. The Chol ceremony was in many ways a recreation of the Sinai experience. All of the people gathering together, crowding around, ready to receive the word of the Torah. And Sukkot perfectly sets that scene for the generations. The text describes that the Sukkah itself is reminiscent of how God took care of the people after they left Egypt and were traveling through the wilderness. And the post-Exodus mindset is similar to the post-harvest mindset of the farming population. They got to enjoy the relief of safely overcoming one challenge, of being led out of Egypt, but that worry of, well, what exactly comes next is never totally erased or far from their minds. And Sukkot plays an integral role in preparing the people, all of the people, to receive the message of the Chol together. The sukkah itself is an equalizer. The hut's rooted in temporary simplicity, erasing divisions of class and status. It brings all of the people together on one plane to celebrate and to be joyful. The question that I want to leave you with this morning and for the remaining days of Sukkot is, how can we manage to channel all of this today? The joy, the accessibility, the equality, and how might we choose to do our own version of the Hakel, our own versions of gathering, of summoning, of including each and every person who wants to be included, who might benefit from hearing this reading, and make sure that no one is left